So we got a file to download, so go ahead and download crimedata.xlsm. And this is actually consolidated data from the data that we worked with last time that we programmed, which was opening files. You remember all those Excel files that had the crime statistics in it? This is the same data that we're working with here. So here, what does this line say here? We've got Alabama. Let's go ahead and look at Utah. Find Utah here. So here's Utah for 2006. Oh, here's us, Brigham Young University. So enrollment in 2006 was 34,000. We had 2 cases of arson, 3 cases of assault, 2 cases of auto theft, 34 burglaries. No rapes reported, 262 larcenies, and that was it for us. So that's the idea. So the point then today is for us to work with pivot tables. And so to use this base data and to make a pivot table. So let's go ahead and first build a pivot table together, and then we're going to dump off the whole workbook, and we'll start again. We want to record ourselves making a pivot table without having already a pivot table there, because it will actually record differently if the pivot table already exists, if there's already one pivot table in the workbook. So let's just go ahead and do pivot tables. So I'm going to come to the Insert menu and choose Pivot Table. And I'll select the defaults here. Let's see. Did it find? Yeah, it found my whole range of data here. And then I'm just going to bring the values. That's the numeric column. And so here then we have this is the sum of all those numbers. What does this number mean? If you were to put a word onto that number, what would it be? Might have to look back at the source data to really understand it, but what does that number mean? Is it a meaningful number? Some of you are saying no. Why not? Why isn't it meaningful? So it's summarized by different labels, and that would be okay if all the labels were of one type, right? So if it was all crime, there's a total incidence of crime. But we also have enrollment kind of thrown in here as well. And so it's like the sum of all the crimes plus all the enrollment. That number is not a useful number, kind of in really any reasonable way. Okay, so let's go ahead and split that out. Let's go ahead and add in the label as the column. So now we got the grand total here, which still isn't very meaningful, but at least we can see total burglary is here. That number means something. In this data set, there are 53,406 burglaries reported. So that's what that means. How about this? What does this number mean here in F, column F? Okay, so does that mean how many people are going to school total? And the answer is no, that's not what it means at all. It's a tempting summarization to say, oh, that's total enrollment. That's the total number of students we have here, but why isn't it total number of students? So let's think about it. Let's suppose we had 2019 numbers reported and 2018 numbers reported. How many of you were students this year and last year? You'd be counted in that twice if that's the case. And so it's not the total number, it's the sum of enrollment, of year-over-year enrollment. So there's a lot of double counting of students in here, assuming that students are there year after year, which we expect they are, at least at this school they are. So that's, anytime we're doing summary data, that's always one of the things we have to think about is make sure that we understand what it means when these numbers get aggregated up. All right, I'm going to go ahead and put the type in above the columns, and or the type in above the label, and that just will give me the ability to have a summary for, if I could get it in there, type, there we go. So now I've got 2 types. I've got crime and information, and that just allows me to split out my enrollment. So now I do get a crime total. That is the total number of crimes reported in this data set, 416,000. The whole purpose of a pivot table is to be able to summarize across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and that's what we got state. So I'll bring in state, school, and campus. And so now we can see, here's the total numbers for Alabama, and now it's split out by state. Split out by college or school, And then when those schools have multiple campuses, those are split out, even further as well. So that's kind of nice. And we got one more report year, which I'm going to put as a filter. So now we can come here and choose, we're going to just look at 2008. So now we're just looking at the numbers for 2008 and so forth. And there's lots of different ways that we could build pivot tables, meaningful ways that we could build pivot tables on this data. This is just the one that we're going to work with today. So our goal is, kind of now that we've seen this once, is to record ourselves building this and then working with the code. As it turns out, the code that's going to get generated is kind of so-so code. We'll execute it once, and if we try to execute again, it will fail because it records stuff based on the actual name of the sheet that it creates for this. So we'll have to modify the code a little bit, but we're going to really clean up the code quite a bit. We'll do one more thing, and that is we're going to collapse these columns here so that they're not all spread out. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do expand, collapse, and collapse entire field. I thought that was what I was going to do. Expand, collapse, collapse entire field. There we go. And I'll do the same thing for state. Collapse entire field. So now, what did I do? Expand, collapse, collapse entire. There we go. So now we can look here. Here's California. We can expand that out. These are all the schools in California. And if we see University of California, we should be able to expand that out and see the different UC schools that are reporting here. So that's nice. All right. But as I mentioned, this code will record differently if we already have one pivot table built on this data. So I'm going to close this workbook without saving it, open it up again, and we'll start recording to do that same process. So close, save the changes, don't save. I'll reopen, and we'll record on this fresh workbook that has no pivot tables in it yet. So developer tab, record a macro. Macro 1, why don't I call it create pivot? All right, we'll go through that same process. And since sounds like you all have some familiarity with it, I'm not going to try to go so that you can keep up with me. I'll just build it, and we'll leave it up there for a minute, and you can kind of get it built to be the same way. I'm inserting a pivot table. That all looks great. Oh, but you know what? We're gonna do this in order here. So the order in which we do a couple of these will be important. I'll put the values in here. That should be fine. And now I'm going to put the type in first and then the label. That'll just make the code, as we see the code, and I'll talk about this when we get there, it'll make the code a little bit more readable for us. If instead of adding one and putting another one above it, I add one and put the other ones below it. So I'll put state first, put school after it, and then put campus after that. Report year as a filter. And then I'll collapse my fields over here. Whoops. Collapse the entire field. And you know what? I may also come down here and just open up Utah. That's the one that's somewhat relevant to me. And here we see, I may also go ahead and freeze the panes right here, select B2, and then do freeze panes so that as this table scrolls, I can kind of still see my headers and stuff. So view, freeze panes, freeze panes. So now if I scroll down, should be able to see that the one place we really excel in crime is arson. I mean, we dominate the state in arson. Isn't that great? We got 5 arsons. No one else even comes close. Actually, it comes from a couple of years. I suspect there was a student here that was committing the arson. Okay, so go ahead and get those configured, and we'll give you a minute until everyone is looking up at me with a satisfied look on their face. Okay, so I am going to stop recording. And then let's go take a look at the code. I think I'm going to take a look at the code. Alt F11. There we go. So here's module 1. And here's our create pivot. All right, so the first thing that we see here is that we're adding a new sheet. So we add a new sheet, and then we're going to be referring to that sheet by its name. And so instead of, that's going to be a problem, right? Because the next time I add the sheet, it's not going to be sheet number 1. And so we're going to have to modify the code to deal with the sheet. So let's do this. A couple things we could do. We could add the sheet, and then we could find out what the name of that sheet was, and then we could use that variable to drop here every time we say sheet 1. But what I like better is to create a sheet variable, s as a worksheet, and then let's just set s equal to the return value of the sheet's add method. Set s equal to, and so that is going to, so now anywhere I've got sheets, sheet 1, I should just be able to refer to it by s. Okay. So now let's go ahead and take a look at this first block, which is hideous. But we'll kind of peel it apart and it won't be so bad. So active workbook, no problem, getting to our active workbook. We've got a collection of pivot caches. Pivot cache, what's a pivot cache? I thought we were making pivot tables. All right, so it turns out that when we build a pivot table, step 1 is to get the data organized in such a way that that pivot table is ready to work with it. And that organization of the data is called a pivot cache. Typically, you're probably most familiar with working with pivot tables for Excel, for data that's already in Excel. But Excel can work with data that comes from lots of different sources. You can hook straight onto a database. You can hook onto a text file. You can hook onto some online source. And so the pivot cache says, wherever the data is, bring that data in such a way that we're ready to manipulate it for the pivot table. And then we build the pivot table on the pivot cache. So we've got a collection of pivot caches here, and we're calling the create method. Open parenthesis begins the arguments for the create method. And we say, what's the type? Oh, it's an Excel database, so it's here in Excel. Source data, oh, this is a problem because we've got this hard-coded. Why is this a problem? That's right. I think the whole idea here is that we're going to import some new data. I think the data ends in 2010. We've got 2011, 12, 13 data coming in. Let's bring that data in and let's run this again. And if this is coded to end right there at row, 23,000, then that's going to be a problem. So we'll want that to be dynamic. But let's pause on that for a minute. And then version 6 of the pivot cache creator, apparently. And then that closing parenthesis is the end of the create method of the pivot cache collection. So what's this dot create pivot table? How could that even work? What's going on that allows that to work? I've got some object, I call a method create, and then right after that I call another method create pivot table. Someone tell me what's going on. Or is it just mystical? Must be magic. We just had St. Patrick's Day. It's probably a leprechaun in there doing something. Okay, so just in the same way that when we add a sheet, we call the add method of the sheets class, it creates a new sheet. But what does it also do? Not only does it create that sheet, but it returns a reference to the sheet that just got created. That's why we can say set s equal to it, is because this is sending back the reference to the sheet that just got built. Same thing's happening here. We create a pivot cache, and it returns a reference to that newly created pivot cache. And so everything right up to here then evaluates as that it refers to that newly created object. We're just calling a method of the newly created object. I'm going to split this into 2 different lines just because it's a little bit convoluted there. Oh no, why did this line go red as soon as I separated that apart? It's because we've got parentheses here indicating that we're doing something with the return value. We're creating a pivot cache and we're doing something with what that thing returns. Well, in the past, what were we doing? We were calling the create pivot table method. But now what I want to do is I just want to capture a reference to that object. So I'm going to dim PC as a pivot cache. And so now all I'm going to do with the return value is capture the reference. So I'm going to set PC equal to that create method. Okay, Now let's go ahead and handle this problem here. So this is hard-coded. We want this to be the whole set of data that starts from A1. What method of arrange will be really helpful to us to say, give me all the contiguous data? Yeah, the current region. Now, you'll notice that this is a string, but it turns out, and this is often the case in methods in VBA, is that when I have a string that is the reference to a cell, I can actually give just the reference to that cell instead. And so let's just say here, we're talking about the crime data sheet. On the tab, it's called crime data, but the actual code name is just data. So I'm just going to call this data dot range A1 dot current region. And so that should be the source of my data. And we'll build a pivot cache then on that. Okay. So now what we used to do is we used to just say, hey, right there when that pivot cache gets created, run the create pivot table on the pivot cache itself. So now what do we have to modify here? We can't just start with a dot. Yeah. So we captured the reference to the pivot cache that was created. So now we're going to say pc.createPivotTable. Now we're going to want to refer to that pivot table as well. So let me declare a variable here called pt for pivot table as a pivot table. Here then I'll come in and say set pt equal to this. And there's one more syntactic thing I have to do to make this work. If I try to leave this line, it's going to go red. There's an error here. What's the error? Syntactically, what's the error? It has all the same parameters that it had before. This is one of the frustrating things about VBA. It's the parentheses, yeah. Remember that if I'm doing something with the return value, I've got to have parentheses. In the past, this code didn't do anything with the return value, just created the pivot table. But now we're capturing the reference to that pivot table, so we've got to put parentheses around the argument list. And so now that should give me a pivot cache and a pivot table. Okay. Let me just kind of preview the rest of this code. It's kind of a lot. And we're going to dramatically reduce this. All right. So first thing it says here is we are going to select sheet 1. Yeah. Oh, yeah, good point. Not only do we have to change the destination, we're going to have to change the name of the pivot table. So thanks for pointing that out. I almost went right past it. So same thing here. Let's just go ahead and put a reference to that newly created sheet. That newly created sheet is S. And what was it putting it in? A3. S.range. A3. Now, pivot table name, I'm not sure if that's going to be a problem, because I think if I've got it on a different sheet, I can have two pivot tables with the same name. But you know what? I don't care about the name, and I'm betting that if I don't supply it, in fact, you can see here the table name is optional. You can tell it's optional because it's in square brackets here in the little IntelliSense help. Because that's optional, I'm just going to get rid of it. And I'll let Excel choose whatever name it wants for the pivot table. I don't care. In fact, that's such a short line now, I may just bring it up onto one line. Okay, now we get this line recorded here saying we're going to select sheet 1. Okay, there's two problems here. Well, one problem and one thing that's kind of extraneous. First is we can't be sheet 1, and so what should we change that to? Yeah, that's a reference to the newly created sheet, and so I'm just going to do S for that. But why would we need to select that sheet? It turns out it's already the active sheet, right? We added the worksheet. When you add a new worksheet, it becomes the active sheet. There's really no reason even to select it. And there's no reason to select any cells on this sheet. So I'm going to get rid of both of those lines as well. Okay, so this next block, dealing with this pivot table that was created. We got to deal with this. But did I change any of these things? Column grand has auto format, display error string, display. I don't remember changing anything that corresponds to this. And I think what we're seeing here is that this whole block, these are just like the defaults that happen. Now, if I had changed some of them, it might be interesting. I definitely don't need all of them, and I didn't change any of them. So I'm just going to get rid of all of those. Those are just the defaults. I mean, if I say create a pivot table, it's got to give a value for all those things, and it's just going to be the default. Oh, look at this next one. Again, the default. I didn't change anything about whether to refresh on opening or not. And so I'm just going to get rid of this next block as well. Missing item limits. I didn't do anything with missing item limits. Those are just defaults getting recorded. Same thing here. I didn't change anything on repeat all labels. I don't need this one. Okay, now here's where we're actually configuring the pivot table. So we are adding a data field. So here's where we're bringing on our value field, and it's going to be a sum. All right, so active sheet pivot tables, pivot table 2. What is that line of code trying to do? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Just the part that I have highlighted. It's just trying to get a reference to, the newly created pivot table. Well, we captured a reference to that newly created pivot table, so anywhere we see that, we should just be able to replace it with PT. So PT, add data field. Oh, here it is. Here's another one. Active sheet, pivot tables, pivot table 2. And that's the reason we don't just do a find and replace, is because this one's actually broken in the middle of it. So we're calling the add data field method of the pivot table, and we're going to add one of the pivot fields. So we'll change that to PT, and that should be the one that puts the sum of all of our prime numbers is going to go down into the value portion. Right? That's the part that's making this happen on our pivot table. Okay, let's look at these next two because they're a pair. Here's where we're adding the type of row that it was, and then we're adding the label. And so again, we've got the width right up here to pivot table 2. I'm going to change that to PT. And that says we're going to make our pivot field, our pivot field named type, we're going to make that with a column field. Now, before this line of code runs, we don't have any column fields. So what position do you think it's going to be if I don't tell it to be a position? It's going to be position 1. I don't have to say that. And if I don't have to say that, there's no reason to have the width here because there's only one statement. Let me back off the width, and bring that up onto one line and get rid of the end width. Same thing here. I'm now adding on the label, right? So that first line, put in the type, and now we're adding in the label here. And again, if we don't tell it where to go, it's going to assume it should go as the newly added one. It's going to show in the bottom. So same thing here. I'm going to just get rid of the whole width and get that to be a PT. Bring up the orientation and get rid of the rest of this. And I'll even put those two together because those are doing my column. I'll just run my two column fields together. The next three is more of the same. So let's just go ahead and kind of collapse these down in the same way. We're doing the row fields here. So pivot table. Whew. So that gives my 3 rows then done up, and the right order, state, and then more specific is the school, and more specific still is the campus. So I've got those going in an order. That looks great. We've got the same thing for the report filter. Now it looks like I was doing some selecting. I don't have to select A11, but we're showing, let's see. We're saying don't show the detail for the school. Yeah, I like that. No reason to select A11. And get down to the pivot table. Show detail false. And it looks like I'm going to have that for both school and for state. Might be easier just to copy that line and change it to say state. Pivot items. I think I had a misstep here where I just did one of them. We're scrolling, we're selecting. Okay. So now here I'm actually saying I want to show the detail for Utah. So that one we're going to leave in place. Scrolling, we'll select B6. We'll freeze the panes. Active window, freeze panes, and we don't need to scroll. That should do it. Okay, we're not quite ready to run this yet. But do you have any questions on getting this far? Yes. The question is, how does it know where to freeze the panes? And the answer is we selected B6. So we select right there and say freeze panes, and that will freeze that. It'll freeze the rows above it and the columns to the left of it. Question? Okay, so what we're saying, the question is, what's going on right here? And the answer is, show detail is that when we have these nested levels here, so we have the state, and then within the states we have schools, and within the schools we have campuses. Show detail true would be those things are all expanded out. Show detail false collapses them down, so if the user wants to see them, they have to go, kind of drill into them. So we're collapsing everything. The assumption here is that in the way that we use this, Utah is the most interesting. We want to see the other ones there, but we're a Utah school, and so that's probably going to be the one that we want to show expanded out, but the rest of them we'll leave collapsed. That's what that's doing. So this is collapsing everything and then showing Utah. And then this block right here is freezing the panes so that we get our columns and our headers fixed. Okay, before we run this, I'm going to put a breakpoint right here before we create that pivot cache. And I'm going to run it right to this point right here. All right, we're just getting ready to create the pivot cache. Well, the truth is, I already created that pivot cache when we record ourselves doing this. And there's really no reason for me to create another pivot cache right on this same data. So let's just take a look and make sure there's a pivot cache there. So I'm going to look at this workbook, .pivot caches. .count, and should be just one. And so if we've got more than 0 pivot caches, we just want to use the number 0 pivot cache. Or if we have one or more, we want to use the first pivot cache. So let me go ahead and bring this into an if statement. I'm going to say if this workbook's pivot caches count is equal to 0, then we got to create one. Otherwise, we just want to hook up to one of them. Set PC equal to this workbook pivot caches number 1. And it's a collection, so it is one-based. So we are, if the count is 1, then there'll be pivot cache number 1 will be there. Okay, so now I'm going to come back to drag my current position up to the if statement and just kind of step through this. And it should go through the second path. So now we're binding on to the existing pivot cache, and we're ready to make a new pivot table. You should have already created a new sheet. Yep, there's sheet 2. And I'll just go ahead and run the rest of this out, and it should build the pivot table now on that data. So here's our sheet 1 pivot table. Here's sheet 2. The only thing different is that I got to scroll down a little bit to be able to see where I've got Utah and that data expanded. But it's, now a pivot table that I can configure and let the user do what they want to with it. Look at 2008 data. So we've really simplified this code a lot. Almost fits on one screen here now. If I took a bunch of these white space blank lines out, it would fit, but I think it's a little more readable with the white space in it. Questions? How many of you are looking at this saying, yeah, this isn't too bad? I mean, don't you see there's a pivot cache and a pivot table and got to manipulate fields? How many are feeling pretty comfortable with this? How many are saying, you know what, let's do another example? A couple of you? Okay. So why don't we do this? We've got the project that's due tonight. Why don't we call that good here for now? And those of you that are interested in seeing another example, once you kind of come up, we'll huddle around the computer and do an example. The rest of you will take a little while here. You can work on your projects, and I'll be available to answer questions. All right, so we'll call that good for today.